Hey guys, how's it going? Kermode here. Welcome to our Cymatics beginner guide on starting in Ableton. This is a video series covering everything you need to know to get started in Ableton so you can navigate your way around, start making sounds, bringing sounds in, and of course, writing music. Now, before we get started, I recommend you head down to the description of this video where we're actually giving out our Ableton starter pack. This pack has our free Ableton Future Bass project in it, so you can dissect that. Our free Bass House Ableton project, so you can dissect that. Our Kicks Collection Volume 1, our Kicks Collection Volume 2, our Free Effects Pack, Snare Collections Volume 1 and 2, our Vocal Chop Pack 1 and 2, our Vocal Chant Build-Up and Phrases Pack, our Build-Up Drums, our Piano and String Loops, our Synth Loops Volume 1 and 2, and a PDF with every single Ableton shortcut. Now, if you have no clue what I'm talking about, those are primarily samples. And what samples are, if you imagine you were a painter, Ableton's kind of the canvas and samples are the paint. So we're giving you all of the tools you need to write music. And with this course, you'll know everything to do with it. And again, it's free. So just head on down to the description of this video so you can go grab it and you can follow along using those tools. To start things off, we're going to be going through the preferences of Ableton, where I'm going to show you just some features that you need to have on or off, and maybe summarize a few things just so your Ableton's set up and ready to go. Then what we're going to go through is the workflow and the layout of Ableton. Ableton's not really your typical DAW. There's some features that are a little different and the workflow is a little different. And of course, the layout of it is just really complex. There's a lot to look at when you first open it. So I'm going to summarize the majority of it, or at least the things you really need to know. So we've got a lot to cover, so without further ado, let's get going. First, I want to go into our Ableton settings so we can set certain things up so it's ready to perform in the exact right way. So on Mac, you can head up and click the live button in the top to reach your preferences, or for a nice shortcut, you can hit Command comma on Mac or Control comma on PC. Now with our preferences open, we're going to go through it tab by tab. First is the Look Feel tab. The Look Feel tab is where we're going to change the visual display of Ableton. Right now, I think the only things you need to know, however, are the zoom display, which will allow you to zoom in out, creating more space in your DAW. And then secondly, the brightness and skin can help customize things. Skins can be really fun to change things around and make it feel a little more your own. The audio tab is where you're going to pick a few important settings. First, up top is where you can select your input. The input is going to be the audio coming into your DAW, and right now you can see I have a specific one, the Native Instruments Complete selected, because that's how my microphone is actually being routed into Ableton right now. After you select your output device, right now I'm selecting my headphones because if I was going out through my sound card, it would go out through my speakers, back into my microphone and create some feedback. So this is how you can customize the routing of the sound in your Ableton. Sample rate is a bit of a nerdy thing to go into right now, so we'll skip that. For buffer, however, I think this is an important one, especially for those who want to record. This is going to change the latency in your Ableton. I have mine to a very short one right now because I'm recording my voice and I don't want there to be any delay. This will cause some problems with really extensive Ableton sessions though, because my computer is working harder to save myself those milliseconds of latency, and sometimes it can kind of cause digital dropouts and crackling. So it's up to you to change this as you go. But again, shorter sample sizes will have less latency, and the bigger sample size will have more latency, but less likely for your computer to bag out trying to figure that out. The Link Midi tab is where you can set up external MIDI controllers. I'm not going to go into this right now, so if you have a MIDI controller, just know this is where you're going to need to go to properly set it up and get it working. Under the file folder here, there isn't too much you need to know right now. However, if you are using third-party plugins, and for those that don't know what plugins are, they're pieces of software created by other companies that work inside of Ableton. And if you're trying to get your Ableton to recognize one, you can hit this rescan button here after you've installed it, and you're likely to find it. Moving on to the library tab, there's not too much you need to know. I would recommend having this collect files on expert off because that will use up a lot of memory on your computer. Normally an Ableton session will find the samples on your computer where they natively are from and just pull them in and use them in that way. If you do it this way, however, it'll save a copy of the file to that specific Ableton session, which is good if you want to transfer it to other computers. However, it's going to use up a lot of memory on your computer, so for now, you can just leave it like that. Now on the Record Warp Launch tab, there are a few important things here. The first is setting up how your computer records files into Ableton. So first you can select a file type, either WAV or AIFF. There's no real better file type. WAV is a little more common, so I might recommend that one. Bit depth again is another nerdy thing that we don't have time to go into right now, but I recommend a minimum of 24. Moving forward, another important setting is potentially your default warp mode. Now, warping is how Ableton can stretch and manipulate audio, and we'll be going into the different types of warp modes. The most transparent, the one that you as a new Ableton user will probably notice the least, is complex. It will probably seem the cleanest to you right now, so I might recommend that one. And one last important setting is turning off fades on clip edges. What this does is when you bring in an audio file into Ableton, it will actually create little volume fades, which is used to prevent popping and clicking with sounds that might start with a click or a pop. But these fades can actually damage things such as drums and other sounds because it'll take away that initial thwack or impact. So for now, I would turn this setting off. The last two tabs, CPU and licensing, don't have anything that we need to know right now, so we can move on from here. Next up, we're going to talk about the layout of the DAW. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about how to do things right now. I just want you to know your way around, know what things are, know where things are, and later I'll explain a little more of the functionality of everything. So first, I want to talk about Session View. Session View is this window here, and in this window, this is where you're going to test out ideas, almost like a painter's palette. This is where you're going to be mixing colors, testing combinations, and trying things out. Now, it can be as simple as finding a sample and dragging it in and testing it out with another one. So I'm just going to give you a quick example so you're starting to understand more of what I'm talking about. So I'm going to drag in a sample here. And you'll notice when I dropped it into a blank area, it created a new audio track for it. Now I'm going to drag in another beat underneath it. And I'm going to hit the play button here to play one of them. Now, when I try and play the next one, you'll notice they will not play at the same time. The next one will actually overwrite it. The reason for this is you can have only one source of audio playing per audio track. Now, in the session view, there are not only audio tracks to test things out on, but MIDI tracks. MIDI stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. What that actually means is this is where you can actually input notes that will actually trigger anything from drums to instruments. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click one here to pull up a piano roll, and you'll see it looks like a piano left to right here. And I will input some notes. Don't worry about how I'm putting the notes in here, more on that later. But just watch what happens when I hit play now. You won't actually be hearing anything because there's nothing to trigger it. So what we're going to do is we're going to put an instrument on, and more on this in a second, to actually trigger a sound. Now we can start to test out these ideas. I'm going to drag in a few more musical ideas now to test out. So now I've loaded up tracks, one with beats, one with percussion loops, and one with vocal loops. Now I'm going to start testing out ideas. This really shows off how Ableton is an instrument, and you can really test out your different colors, your different ideas in this area here. Once you start to have a clear idea of what combinations are working in this view too, you have one last thing that is known as scenes. Scenes are arrows that will trigger entire rows of information. This is really useful when performing live or once you have more of an idea of what you want in the timeline of your song, so you can set up, say, a verse and a chorus and a build-up, and instead of having to trigger a bunch of buttons, you can trigger just one. Then once you have that idea, we can move on to the arrangement view. Now this is the arrangement view, and this again works very linearly, and this is where you will finalize your song and put it in a left to right manner. So I'm going to drag in the same ideas here, but the difference is you can see them left to right. One thing you may have noticed too is that when I'm in the arrangement view here and the session view here, that the tracks actually correlate. We have my voice, beat, percussion, and vocals. And when I move over, they're actually the exact same, just laid out in the two different views. All the setting changes will correlate over exactly as well. If I turn the volume down on the beat and we move over, you'll see that the volume moved down on this fader here. Moving back, I changed it there. So they're actually the exact same tracks, just in two different views. Now you may be wondering what happens if we have information on the track in arrangement view and information playing from session view. Well, session view is always going to end up dominating because session view is where you're going to be testing out ideas, and again, it's more of the live aspect. So this is where you can actually bring things in, and it will just gray out what's going on here. So for example, if I hit play on the beat here, and I'm just going to turn off these tracks so we're only hearing the beat, and I head on over to this view here and trigger something and go back, you'll see that things are grayed out. This being grayed out means we're listening to session view right now. What you can do, however, is if you see this big orange button here, this is the back to arrangement button. When you click this, it'll go back to your timeline how it was. So you could test out ideas in session view without being destructive or destroying any of the finalized ideas in the arrangement view. Now to jump between these two views, if you head on up to the top right corner here, you'll see these two buttons here. This one obviously meaning arrangement, and this one being session, and obviously represented by the horizontal and the vertical lines. A nice shortcut as well, because you're likely going to be jumping between these two views quite a bit, is simply tab. That'll jump between the two views nice and easy. Now I briefly talked about this before, but we're going to go into greater detail about it now, and that is audio tracks and MIDI tracks. Audio tracks can host all types of audio, from single drum hits to input of audio from a live instrument to loops or even full songs. Now MIDI clips are going to host that MIDI information I was talking about. MIDI information, really all it is an on-off switch represented by those red squares. Opening it up again, just showing you these little red squares here are MIDI. And that MIDI is the on-off switch that will trigger specific notes on specific instruments. Now to trigger any clip, again, it's just hitting this play button here. When you want to stop a clip, however, you can hit any of the stop buttons on the other tracks, these squares, or you can click the stop button at the bottom. Now for audio tracks, you have to physically drag audio in for anything to be there, but with MIDI, you can simply double click a little empty clip slot, and a MIDI clip will appear of exactly 1 bar in length. Don't be afraid to drag multiple clips in at once too. I simply held shift to highlight a few and drag them in, and you'll notice it extends infinitely. At first glance it seems like there's a limit to the tracks, but you can actually just drag in as many as you want. So there's no limit to how many ideas you can test out. To create a new audio track, simply right-click the bar here to insert an audio track, or click it here to insert a MIDI track. The same applies in this view here. You can find an empty area, insert audio track, or insert MIDI track. Sometimes you will run into problems, however, where I can't scroll any further to right-click. So what you can do is you can hit Command T on Mac or Command Shift T for a MIDI track. Now let's start to look further as to what makes up these tracks. Up top, you have the title bar where you can right-click to rename a specific track. So we're going to call this loops because this is where I've been dragging in loops. Or you can see on the left, I've labeled this one my voice. Now, next you've seen this is where you drag in clips or MIDI clips and how you trigger them, but you do need to know how to stop them. So if they're going, you have 2 options. You can stop them by hitting the stop buttons on the individual tracks around them or the master stop button at the bottom. You'll notice when a clip is playing, that there's a little circle here with time beside it. What this is saying how long this track is in bars. And if you don't know about bars or beats, I recommend after this video maybe looking up some rhythm theory. But it says in bars how long a clip is and when it's going to loop around. So if I press play here, it's going to loop around. And this will disappear when you hit stop, so the clip's no longer playing. Next up, we're going to look at the input section and the output section of each individual track. So here's where you can select where the audio or MIDI is coming from. Obviously, audio tracks can only accept audio and MIDI can only select MIDI. And the first thing you want to do is use this drop-down menu to select where the audio is coming from. So in this case, I've selected the external input, and that's the sound card I set up with my microphone, and we looked how to pick that in preferences. But you can also select the input from other audio tracks, for example, and record in from there. With MIDI, you can do the same thing, but obviously just with MIDI sources. So right now my computer keyboard is my only MIDI source, but you can hook up other controllers, or you could even select input from other MIDI tracks. We'll go into why you would want to do that in a future tutorial. Next up, there's another drop-down menu, and this is for inputs with more than one option. So for example, my sound card that my microphone is plugged into right now has 2 inputs, so we have 2 options. However, the microphone can only be plugged into one of the 2, so I selected 1. Next up is the monitoring settings, and this is determining whether you're listening to the incoming signal and under what circumstances. So by default, it's actually set to auto. And what this means is when the track is armed and you're playing something, you'll hear it. But when you trigger a clip, it'll actually stop playing the incoming signal. So if, for example, if I set my voice to auto here, when I play this clip here, it's actually going to cut me off. So I'm going to keep talking, and right in the middle of my sentence, I'm going to So that was pretty rude of that clip. Now in what we had originally, we will hear the incoming signal no matter what. So right now, obviously you can hear me, and even if there was a clip on here playing, you would be able to hear my voice, and you can't actually hear the clip anymore, which is interesting. The last one is off, where you can actually not hear the incoming signal. Now the reason for this, for example, is say you were recording something in a live room, you had the guitar in the same room as the microphone, as the same room as the speakers, and you wanted to record the guitar into your Ableton. Well, you wouldn't want that recording of the guitar to then go back out your speakers, which will then go into the microphone and back in and create a loop. You'd want to have it off, so Ableton's still getting the signal, it's still recording the signal, but it's not outputting through the speakers. Next is where you're selecting where the audio is going to. So by default, it's going to the master track, and more about the settings on that in a minute. And the master track is where all the sound is going to come out of typically, and this is where you're going to export all the sound from in the end, typically, is everything being routed through this one master track. You do, however, have the option to send audio to other tracks if you wanted to, or even external out, which will completely bypass the master. This is good if you want to have, say, a reference song and you don't want your reference song to be hitting all the same effects that maybe the song that you're working on is going through. Now I'm going to skip these send knobs here for a minute. We're going to come back to it in just a second, but we're going to move on to the mixer here. Now the mixer has a few settings. Right off the bat, you're going to see that it has this volume meter, so you can see how loud things get. And if you click this arrow, I can actually change the volume of things. Really useful. Here you'll have a meter readout, and what this will say is the loudest peak that your sound has hit. So it's not showing you the average volume, but it's going to show you the loudest moment. So the loudest moment of my voice so far has been -3 decibels, but when I get a bit louder like that, it jumps up and will show me how loud the loudest part of my sound is. Next up is panning, so you can pan things either from the left or to the right. Same across all tracks. You'll notice the MIDI track, however, doesn't have that, and that's just because there isn't an instrument on there right now. If I drag an instrument on, you'll notice that the MIDI track then takes on the same characteristics, if you're wondering about that. Next is the power button. This is just the on-off switch for all the tracks, whether it's going to be audible. You can still have ideas going and playing on a track, but when it's off, the audio is no longer going to be going to wherever it's supposed to go. Next, you have solo buttons. So this is so you can listen to one thing at a time. So you can isolate certain sounds in your song and just shape and curate one sound. So it's really useful to know the solo button. Next is the record arm button. This is how you can actually record things, is you need things to be armed before you hit record for that track to record. And the same goes for audio and MIDI. You'll notice MIDI has a little music note symbol in it because it's going to actually record the notes that I play, not the audio. You'll notice when I armed the track that the stop buttons actually turned into little circle buttons. The reason for this is I can actually now record a clip. So if I hit record, and we start recording this clip, and I stop, I can now, if we went to monitoring auto, play this clip so we can hear it. And we start recording this clip, and we start recording this clip, and we start recording. Now MIDI, again, a little differently. If it's armed, you'll see it also turns into record buttons. But what will happen now is I'll actually play notes on my keyboard, and that will be recorded into a clip up above. So that's a nice alternative way to make clips beyond just dragging things in or creating a new MIDI clip. You can actually record them, hence some of the more live aspects of live. Now, before we look at the sends, I just want to move back to arrangement view because we haven't been there for a while. And I just want you to know that everything actually directly correlates. So here we have the inputs, and here we have the off buttons and the solo and the record and the pan. And the sends are represented by these little things here. So now we can take a peek at the sends. So what sends allow you to do is they allow you to send volume to a return channel. So for example, I have a return channel over here called reverb. And you'll notice as I send more of my voice to this reverb channel, it starts to go more and more to this channel, and we hear it more and more reverberated. Now these tracks are specifically made for having effects on them, and they are not meant to host any form of audio or host any form of MIDI. You simply send sound to them. The reason for this is, say for example, we had this reverb and we wanted to use it on a lot of elements in the track. Well, instead of having to copy and paste it onto all these different tracks, which will use up a lot of your computer's processing power and is a lot harder to keep track of, you could send a bunch of elements all to this reverb and they all take on that similar characteristic. Now, unlike audio tracks, there is actually a limit to the amounts of sends and returns you have, and the total number is 12. This is really fun in live settings too, if you want certain things to be affected for short periods of time. For example, on this return channel here, we have a delay effect, and I want to, for a split second, send my voice to that delay, 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 delay. So those are really fun. On the returns, they don't have the option of taking audio from external sources or MIDI from external sources like these, because again, all they can accept is the audio from the sends. And lastly, we have the master track here. Now, we already briefly talked about scenes and how you can trigger rows of clips with scenes, and that's all that you're going to see on this master track is scenes, because obviously this is getting audio from everything in your song, so it can't host anything on these clip slots. Below, you'll have a master stop button, which will allow you to stop all clips at once, which is really, really useful. And you have the master back to arrangement button, which again, when session view is taken over and everything's working there, you can actually prevent that and just listen to everything that was going on in the arrangement view. Now, next you have the cue out and the master out. Now, this is obviously selecting where the cue out and the master out are going. Now, the master out is where the master, the song, the whole song that you're listening to is actually going to. But your cue out is a separate output where you can actually cue certain clips and hear them separately from the master. This is really useful for live performance, so you can hear ideas and clips before the audience hears them. So you can test out ideas with your cue out here. Next, you'll see pre and post fader buttons for the sends and returns. What this means is simply whether the signal being sent is being read before or after the mixer. So for post mixer, this loop channel would be sent after it's reading the volume change based off this mixer. But if it's set to pre, then that won't actually change anything. The reason for this is, say for example, at the end of my song, I'm fading out the song like this, but I didn't want the volume of my reverb to change. So you can just set it to pre, so it's as if it was at full volume before you started affecting it. Lastly, the master has the same volume meters right here, same panning as well. But the last thing you're going to see is this headphone button here, and this is just a preview or cue volume. This is going to be the volume of previewing things in the browser, or the volume of previewing cued clips for your live performance. And while we're in the bottom right corner here, I'm going to show you how you can actually hide and show some hidden features inside of Ableton. And that's with these little buttons here. And what they're going to do is they're going to show and hide certain windows inside of Ableton that might not be there all the time. So first, the little IO is the in and out part of the tracks there, and that's how we were routing things, and you can actually hide that, or if you're wondering why you weren't seeing that in your own Ableton, it's because they were hidden with that button there. Next, you can hide the send knobs and the return channels to save yourself some space, or if you don't use them, you can hide them. Next is the mixer. You can actually hide that too to clear up some space and make things look a little cleaner. Now, there are a couple ones we didn't have open because they're not quite as important, but I'll show you really briefly. There's the track delay, which is a hidden feature which allows you to delay tracks forward or backward in milliseconds. Let's say, for example, my kick drum was triggering a little late because the sample was a few milliseconds late. Well, you can actually delay it backwards 2 milliseconds, and what that will do is it'll delay everything else in Ableton 2 milliseconds so it lines up. Then there's also the crossfader window here. Because Ableton's also used for live performance, it comes equipped with a crossfader like you would see on a DJ mixer. A crossfader allows you to fade between volume between deck A and deck B. And if you simply select which tracks are going to deck A or deck B, you'll notice we'll actually fade out of them as we move to the left here and fade back in as we move back over. So this is really useful, but again, I had mine closed and my track delay closed because I don't typically use those features too often, but that's just me. Next up, and one of the most important parts, is the browser window up here in the left. Now the browser, if you couldn't see it, can be opened and closed with this arrow here. And this is how we're going to find every single sound and instrument and effect to bring into our song. Now the first window here is sounds, and what it does is it has actually, when I downloaded Ableton, categorized my different types of instruments into different categories. So for example, I can go to string type sounds and drag them into a MIDI clip, or drag in this cello, or if I'm looking for more of a piano type sound, I go into there and I open up those folders to drag it in. And it's as simple as clicking the side arrow of a folder to dig into it and really see what's in there and bring it in and bring in that sound. Next is drums, where you have it categorized in a few different ways. The first is drum hits, where you have actual single pieces of audio here that you can drag into audio tracks, or the drum rack instrument, which by default is an empty drum kit instrument in Ableton, or preset drum kits, so you can easily drag things in and start playing the kit. Ableton comes equipped with tons of different drum kits as well for easy use. Next up is instruments, and instruments are the blank instruments in Ableton, their default settings, and these are all the different sounds we saw earlier in their rawest forms before they're making any interesting sounds. So you'll notice most of them will come in very simple, or in some cases completely blank. Now, if you really want to get in there though, and you want to start just using these for their sounds, you can pop open the arrow here, and they come equipped with what are known as presets. And what presets are is they are this instrument already with specific settings to sound a certain way. So for example, there are brass settings under here for the analog instrument that sound a bit like brass. Or if I want more of a string sound for this type of instrument. Or let's test out a different instrument and go for more of a vocal sound from operator. Now these are the same presets that were actually categorized in the sound section, but again, this is where you can come in and you can get the raw versions of these instruments so you can make your own instrument out of it. Next up are audio effects, and these are effects that go after the instrument or after the piece of audio, so you can affect it in a certain way. So let's say we have our choir, and I'm going to drag in a basic effect without going into what it is, and you can start to use that effect on the previous sound. And again, with any of these audio effects, it's the same as instruments. You just click and drag it in, and it'll jump on a track, and you can start to use it. The nice thing about audio effects too is they can be placed on both audio tracks and MIDI tracks, and they will just happen after the incoming signal. Next up are MIDI effects. MIDI effects in the browser are effects that only go on MIDI tracks, and they actually go before the instrument because they're actually going to affect the incoming signal. So without going into detail about what these are, let's say for example I'm playing one note on my keyboard here. When I trigger this MIDI effect, something different is going to happen to that incoming note. This effect, for example, repeats that note over and over. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the effects right now, that's later, but just know there are MIDI effects there. Next is Max for Live, where you can grab Max for Live devices. This will include any that you download from the infinite amount on the internet, or the ones that come with Ableton Suite. So now you have more effects in here, and they're categorized into audio effects, instruments, and MIDI effects, like we saw before, instruments, audio effects, and MIDI effects, but specifically the ones that are Max for Live devices. Next you have plugins, and what plugins are third-party pieces of software that work inside of Ableton. So these are pieces of software, instruments, effects, anything made by different companies that you can bring in. So this is continuing to make Ableton so powerful and so infinite because you're not limited by the already amazing instruments and sounds that come with Ableton, but now you can drag in any sort of software by any sort of company to really maximize your creative potential. Next up in the browser are clips, and these are clips like we were talking about with audio clips here or MIDI clips here, but they're already clips that came with Ableton with preconceived ideas in them. So for example, I bring this clip in, this one was an audio clip. And you can go through and preview them and simply drag them in. Now some of them will be audio clips or MIDI clips, and unfortunately there's no way of knowing until you drag them in. So far we've gotten lucky and all of them have been audio. But some of them, for example, like this one, is actually a MIDI clip, and we'll bring in the whole instrument with it as well as the clip. Next up are all the samples on your computer that Ableton can find, and it just puts them into a big list. Now this is really messy, but can be useful at times, which actually brings me to the search up here, and this allows me to search, for example, for all the kick drums, all the snares, or even vocals. This search bar works as well within the categories, so I could look for some sort of vocal if there are any. And I can see there was something called Focus In. Continuing to move down, you'll notice when I play a sound that sound's waveform will actually show up below right here. This is really useful for getting a sense of how long a sound is or things like that. And there's a couple things that determine how it gets played back. This first, the headphone button here. If it's off, you won't actually hear something as you're going through, but then the second you turn it on, you'll be able to actually hear that preview. The next is the raw button, and what this does is when it's on, it means the sound will be played in its rawest form, how it was originally intended, but with it off, it will actually allow you to preview sounds in time to the song that you're working on. So for example, if our project here is at 150 BPM and there was a loop at 120 and we were trying to test it out and see if it worked just from the browser here, if the raw button were on, it would be completely out of time because it would play it in its raw form. But if raw were off, it would actually try and warp it to the best of Ableton's ability with my project so I can preview that sound. Lastly, up top, everything is categorized by name by default alphabetically, but you can actually right-click this bar here, and you can actually change how things are organized up top. I would recommend keeping things by name for now, but just know you have that ability. Next are places, and these are defined by you, and you can pick how many. It's really defined by you. I had Ableton Live, so for example, mine has the Live 8 library here. The current project folder, so all the samples I'm using in the Ableton project I'm using right now. And then any sort of folders you want to add in. So you can simply hit add folder to define a folder, and then you can organize your library to be your own. This is, for example, where if you downloaded the pack I was talking about in the beginning of the video, you can hit add folder to actually add this pack to your directory so you can easily drag the samples in and practice some of the ideas we were talking about. Continuing to move down, you'll see these little squiggly lines here, and that is for the groove pool in Ableton. Now, groove is a more of an advanced concept, and I don't really want to go into it in this series, but I recommend on your own time looking up how groove works and just knowing that the groove pool is here when you do go learn about that. Moving down, one of the most important things you guys will need being beginners in Ableton is the info view here in the bottom left corner, which can be opened and closed with this arrow. The info view allows you to get information on anything in Ableton you hover your mouse over. So for example here, this will tell you more about the groove pool by hovering your mouse over it, or you can even hover your mouse over the features within it and Ableton will tell you what that does. If you, for example, forget what some of these buttons here do on the individual track mixers, all you have to do is hover your mouse over with the info window open and it will actually tell you about it. So anytime you're lost in Ableton, just refer to this window and it will help you. Next up is the clips view. So I'm going to find any clip and I'm going to bring it in here. And you'll notice that down below the clip view opened up, and this allows us to see everything about the clip. Now this applies to both audio and MIDI, and I'm going to start us off by looking at an audio clip, but eventually we're going to look at a MIDI clip in a second here. First we'll take a look at this sample display over here. Now first thing you need to know is that you can zoom in by clicking this top title bar and you'll see a magnifying glass, and then click it to also zoom left and right. You can zoom really far into waveforms, which is really, really handy for audio editing. At any point, if you are lost getting zoomed in, you can also double click the title bar here to zoom all the way out. Next, you'll see a series of numbers. These numbers on the ruler are how long in bars and beats this sound is. So for example, we can see from 1 to 2 here, that's a bar, and to the end, that's going to be another bar. So we know that this thing is 2 bars long. Next, what you'll see is some brackets that I can move around, and these are loop brackets. These loop brackets will actually loop certain parts of the sound after we hit play. Before I hit play, I want to tell you about the 2 arrows below it, and those are the start and end markers. So I can start this loop in a different point, but then it will loop just this one section here. Now the stop marker won't be important as long as this thing is looping, but it will be important once we turn off loop, so we will keep it here. Now watch what happens when we hit play. And I'll turn loop off, and it'll stop when it hits that arrow there. Next up, you'll see these little gray arrows. What these are is Ableton was trying to read the transients, the loud points of the sound, for certain markers that you can actually warp. What you can do is you can hover your mouse over one of these markers and double click to create a warp marker. Now what you can do is you can actually stretch and bend these sounds. Imagine your sound is an elastic, and these warp markers here are like nails. The end and the beginning are nailed in by default, and then you can move this around and nail a point in, move this around, nail a point in, and really stretch things. Which is just crazy. Even if there wasn't an arrow trying to read it there, you can also double click at any given point to create an arrow and start to warp things. Now the rest of the clip view is quite complicated, and I'm actually going to save that to our last video because there's a lot to cover inside of there. But just know this is where you can see the waveform and you can start to edit it. Now I'm going to bring in a MIDI clip just so you can see the difference. So I dragged in the MIDI clip here, and the first problem is we can't see all of it. So I'm just going to drag this bar here to open things up. The brackets up top are the same and the time is the exact same, but then you're faced with some different features. The first is the sideways piano roll. This is telling you what notes are being played and triggered by this MIDI. You can easily input your own notes by double clicking or clicking the pencil button up here in Ableton and inputting like that. You can change the length of notes by reaching the end of one and a bracket appearing and then clicking and dragging. And you can click and drag these around into different times and values. There's no limit to how many MIDI notes you can have, so it's really up to you to really try things out. You can also input MIDI by arming this and playing on your keyboard. You'll see my keyboard actually correlates in notes as they highlight up on the left. Next is this headphone button here, this MIDI editor preview button. And what this allows you to do is actually hear the note that you're creating as you drag it around. With it off, nothing. This is useful for previewing sounds, just so you know what they sound like, or even clicking in melodies to test stuff out. You can zoom in and out of this piano roll here by clicking and turning it into a magnifying glass. So you can zoom way out to all 8 octaves or zoom way in so you see less than an octave in one range. You also have this fold function here, which will actually fold the piano roll so you're only seeing the notes that you're using. This is really useful, especially when you use an instrument called a drum rack, so you only see what types of drums you're using. And then lastly, you have a velocity window down here. Now, velocity might be a new concept to you, and what velocity is it's a value per MIDI note which will actually affect something in the instrument. Typically, velocity is mapped to volume. The reason for this is so you can give each note a different volume value for feel. Now again, you can actually map velocity to other things, and we'll go into that later, but typically imagine it as a feel value. How hard you're hitting something would have a stronger velocity. If you were to play an instrument lighter, it would have less velocity because, let's be honest, when you play piano or play guitar or play an instrument, it's not always going to be the same strength. It's always going to be different, so you can actually vary that and give things a lot of feel. And it's as simple as just clicking the little ball and changing it for every single note. If you're missing your velocity window, you can pop it open with that arrow here. Now I want to show you guys about the grid in here and how you can change the grid, and this applies to both clip views and to the arrangement view, and trust me, you're going to be wanting to change the grid quite a bit. You can see in the bottom right here that it says we're at 16th notes, but if I hit Command on Mac and 2, we've actually made that grid wider, and if you press Command 1, you make that grid tighter. You can also press Command 3, which will turn it into a triplet grid, so you can write notes in values of 3 instead of the typical 4. And lastly, you can press Command 4 to actually turn off the grid altogether, so you can actually just move things around really loosely. And again, very important, this also applies to the grid in arrangement view here, and any grids you will see in Ableton, Command 1 and 2 to tighten them. Now again, we're not going to go into any more clip properties because there are far too many to go over right now, but that was the clip view there. Next up is the device view. To get to the device view, similar to heading to the clips view right here, you head on down to the bottom right corner and you click this window here to toggle between them. Now, obviously the clips view is where we kept the MIDI and we kept the audio information, but the device view is where you're going to see the instruments that are on MIDI tracks and the audio effects and MIDI effects that are on each track. So as you drag in and you drop effects on things, they'll all end up here in a linear fashion. You can simply scroll between them to see everything, and it's easy as even dropping them on the actual clips view there. Now MIDI tracks will also have the instrument at the beginning and any MIDI effects that you have on them, but again, audio tracks can only have the audio effects that you drag onto them. If you try and drag an instrument on, it will simply give you an X. But again, just to get to this view, you click here, or alternatively, double click the top title bar, just as you would double click a clip to get to the clips view. Next, let's take a look at the top bar of Ableton. First, here you have a link on or off button. Link, when enabled, will show you how many other Ableton devices with link are around. This is so you can link Ableton devices for live performance, and is a handy new update that came recently with Ableton, which I really think is going to revolutionize Ableton's live performance capabilities. You can even link Abletons for collaborating as well, linking two Ableton side by side where their outputs will be summed and can trigger clips in time with the other one. Next up is the tap button. This allows you to tap the tempo in an Ableton simply by clicking a tempo. This is really good for, say, finding the tempo of an a cappella that you're trying to figure out, or to tap a tempo of something that you're trying to play out live. It's just a really handy button to know. Next up is the tempo inside of Ableton. This is obviously the master tempo for your Ableton and will determine the BPM that your song is playing at. And this tempo is measured in beats per minute, so this is 150 beats per minute is this tempo. Next up are the two nudge button, and this allows you to temporarily decrease or increase the speed of your Ableton so you can synchronize with live musicians or other sources. Next up is the time signature of your song. Quite often music is in 4/4, but sometimes obviously you're going to want to write music in different time signatures. Next up is the metronome. The metronome in Ableton is a click that when you hit play, we'll be playing a metronome on a quarter note so that you can play things in time. This is also important for warping tracks in time, or playing drums in time, or playing virtual instruments in time. Just really, really useful. If you click the drop down menu here, you can actually set a count in, so when you record in Ableton, you can give yourself a 1-bar count in before it starts recording. Next up is the quantize. Quantizing in in Ableton is to avoid errors with timing when playing clips. So for example, earlier in the tutorial, I was launching clips and they were always perfectly in time with one another. And that's because I had it set to quantize 1 bar. So every bar, it would wait to launch that clip and then it would launch it perfectly in time. And you can set how long you want Ableton to wait before launching one of those clips so you can keep them in time with each other. And you can also turn them off if you want more of that live human factor. Next up is the follow arrow, and this is useful for when you're in arrangement view and hit play, your Ableton will actually scroll across and follow that playback scrubber so you can actually see your song play through before your eyes. Next up is the arrangement position, and it just says where in the arrangement view you are in bars, beats, and sixteenths, and you can see that we left off at bar 50. Next up is the play button. You can also alternatively use the space bar to play and stop. Next beside it is the stop button, how you can stop the whole song. And beside it, very important, the record button. This is how we're going to arm things and start recording things. And it will stop recording the second you hit the stop button. And it will stop recording the second you hit the stop button. Next is the MIDI arrangement overdub. What this does is when it's enabled, existing notes in MIDI clips in the arrangement will be mixed with rather than replaced by the newly recorded notes. So what do I mean by this? Typically when I hit record here with my track armed and I play MIDI, it's actually going to overwrite this G. So as I play notes, you see the G's disappear and it gets recorded over. Well, what's useful is if you have this on and you hit record, now it will happen with the G as well and it won't overwrite it. This is really useful for looping ideas and just recording over and building up a melody or building up a chord progression on top of itself without destructively overwriting it. Now the reason this doesn't work for audio is because it just can't combine the audio into one clip recording over and over. It will always overwrite audio as you record over it, so do be aware of that, but with MIDI you can avoid that problem. Now I'm actually going to skip over this automation arm button here because we're going to go over automation in full depth in the last video and it's something I haven't mentioned yet, so don't worry about that right now. And don't worry about this button here, so we're going to keep moving on. Next, these numbers here are actually just saying where our loop is. So similarly to the bars, beats, and sixteenths to where our marker was in the arrangement view, we can actually see where our loop is. So our loop is way over at bar 3, and there it is. We can see these loop brackets here. That's actually our loop right there. Now what we can do is we can loop certain sections of our song by turning this loop button on right here. So I'm actually going to record my voice real quick. I'm recording a loop. And if we zoom in here and I set this to auto, what we're going to do is we're actually going to loop this section. So I'm actually going to move my loop brackets to be the length I desire. And now when we hit play, I'm recording a loop, I'm recording a loop, I'm recording a loop. All you hear is the loop. Now what's really cool as well are the punch in and punch out values here, and what this means is if I start recording before the loop brackets, nothing will be recorded until it hits the punch in, which is where the loop begins, and then it will stop recording when it hits the punch out where the loop ends. And you can choose to have either of these on, so you can have your recording go for a certain amount of time and then stop, or again you can have it start at a certain point so you're not recording over material that was already there, because again I was saying that audio recording is destructive that way. It'll record over what is already there. So I'm actually going to demonstrate that right now. Now I'm going to turn the loop off because I don't want it to continuously loop over and record itself. I just want the punch in and punch out. So I'm going to hit record here and I'm going to keep talking, and you're going to see it's going to start recording and it's stopped once we hit the end there. And you're going to see it's going to start recording and it's stopped. So those are really useful features for both recording and just looping sections of songs so we can hear them over and over and over. And you're going to see it's going to start recording, and you're going to see it's going to start recording, and you're going to see it's, because then as you make changes to it, you can actually hear that in real time. And you can start recording, and you can see it's start recording, and you're going to see it's going to start recording, and you're going to see start recording, and you're going to see start recording. More on what I just did there later. Next up, you can just see the length of the punch-in value. So we can see that it's 1 bar long here. And you can actually just extend the loop, the punch-in value right there. So that's really useful. Moving on, here's the pencil button we actually used earlier. This allows you to draw in MIDI, which is really useful without having to double click. To the right of it is the computer keyboard. Without this enabled, you can't actually trigger MIDI with your keyboard. So with it off, even with this MIDI track armed, as I slam my keyboard here, nothing happens. But if I turn it back on, it starts to work again. The reason for this is you can actually map the keys of your keyboard to different things in Ableton, and you want to be able to trigger those without MIDI notes being triggered. So make sure to just know where that button is if you're wondering why your keyboard isn't triggering anything. Next up, what we just talked about actually is this key mapping button. When I click it, you'll notice a lot of things in Ableton suddenly became orange. What this does is I can click any of those orange things and now hit a note on my keyboard, and it is case sensitive. And now my keyboard will actually trigger that. So watch what happens now when I hit the A that I just assigned to this with the piano roll button turned off. I can actually toggle this on and off. Do note that it is a toggle. It toggles from its minimum value to its maximum value, and it doesn't scroll in between because of course it is just a keyboard. But if you actually hit this key value here, you can actually set the range of that full value and that minimum value for each thing. So let's say, for example, I don't want it to do the full volume range. I can select the decibel value here. And now when I hit it, it only jumps between that range there. So that's really important for things such as send values, which have a lot of points in between. But with things such as the on-off here, it will just toggle it. So that's really useful if you guys don't actually own a MIDI keyboard. You can actually start to map things in Ableton to your computer keyboard so you can start to trigger things and play things. Next up is this MIDI mapping button. So similar to the key mapping button we just looked at, is the MIDI mapping button, but how this works is it's dependent on the MIDI controller you've attached to Ableton. But when you do that, you can simply click a parameter and then either turn a knob or press a button, whatever it is your MIDI controller has, and it will assign it to that. So that's really useful to really harness the full power of Ableton. Next up is your CPU usage here. This percent value is just going to tell you how much of your computer's processing is actually being used up by Ableton. So be wary when things start to get really heavy. Things might drop out or crackle or sound funny, and that's just because your computer is working so hard to work Ableton. So just know that that's there. So there we go. That was part 1 of our Ableton beginner course. I know that's a lot to take in, but don't worry. What you can do is you can actually, again, go grab this free pack in the description of this video and just start testing things out. Just see if you can drag things in, see if you can just understand the geography of Ableton. If things are still confusing, don't worry. I'm going to be going into a lot more detail about a lot of the things I just touched on, but I really just want you guys to know the layout of Ableton before we can move on, because at first glance it's this crazy spaceship, but once you start to know what each parameter is, it's a lot less intimidating and it'll make further lessons a lot easier. So thank you so much. I'm Cymatics, we're Cymatics. This is part 1 of our Ableton beginner course. You've got a lot of homework to do now, and I'll be back soon with part 2. Bye.